Before we dive into this incredible journey through humanity's unbroken record of victory, I need you to do something for me. Hit that like button right now, seriously, right now, because what you're about to discover will completely change how you think about what it means to be undefeated. And drop a comment telling me which human victory gave you the most chills. Trust me, by the end of this story, you'll understand why the galaxy fears and respects just 4 words. Humans never give up. The Galactic War Memorial stretched across 17 different dimensions, its crystalline walls inscribed with the names of every species that had fallen in major conflicts throughout the galaxy's recorded history. Zephyrian War Analyst Kethver floated before the memorial's central database, his translucent form shimmering with barely contained frustration as he reviewed the data for the 1,000th time. "Computer," he said, his voice carrying the harmonic frequencies of his gaseous species, "display the complete military record of all spacefaring civilizations sorted by defeat statistics." The holographic display materialized before him, showing a cascade of numbers that told the story of galactic warfare over the past 3 millennia. The Arcturian hegemony, 1,247 major conflicts, 891 victories, 356 defeats. The Rigel Coalition, 2,156 conflicts, 1,445 victories, 711 defeats. The Crystalline Confederacy, 945 conflicts, 623 victories, 322 defeats. The pattern was consistent across every species, every empire, every alliance. Victory and defeat in various ratios, but always both. War was a statistical game, and the laws of probability ensured that no civilization could maintain a perfect record indefinitely, except for one. "Computer, highlight the human record." A single line blazed golden against the blue display. Human Federation, 847 major conflicts, 847 victories, 0 defeats. Kethver's form flickered with agitation. It was impossible. Not just improbable, impossible. The mathematical likelihood of any species achieving such a record approached 0 so closely that most galactic computers refused to calculate it, declaring the probability undefined by known physics. "Computer, define major conflict parameters." Major conflict parameters: military engagements involving at least 1,000 combat units, lasting minimum 30 standard days, with clear territorial or resource objectives recognized by galactic military tribunal as legitimate warfare. And the human record remains accurate under these parameters? Affirmative. Human record: 847 major conflicts, 847 victories, 0 defeats, 0 surrenders, 0 ceasefires resulting in disadvantageous terms. Kethver had devoted his entire career to understanding military patterns, strategic doctrines, and the mathematical principles that governed large-scale warfare. Every species followed predictable patterns. Even the most successful civilizations eventually met their match, faced impossible odds, or made strategic errors that led to defeat. But not humans. The strange biped species from the 3rd planet of an unremarkable yellow star had been active in galactic affairs for only 847 standard years. In that time, they had faced every conceivable type of enemy: technologically superior civilizations, numerically overwhelming forces, beings with reality-warping abilities, artificial intelligences with perfect logical capabilities, and entities that existed partially outside normal space-time, and they had never lost, not once. "Computer, analyze human combat doctrine. Identify primary strategic advantages. Analysis complete." Human military doctrine exhibits the following characteristics: technological inferiority in 67% of conflicts, numerical disadvantage in 84% of conflicts, strategic disadvantage in 91% of conflicts, tactical innovation rating, extremely high, adaptation speed, unprecedented, surrender probability, 0. The last statistic made Kethverd's gaseous form ripple with confusion. Every species had a surrender threshold, a point at which continued resistance became mathematically irrational. The Arcturians surrendered when casualty rates exceeded 23%. The Rigel species capitulated when supply lines were cut for more than 40 days. Even the notoriously stubborn crystalline entities would negotiate when faced with extinction-level threats. But human surrender probability was listed as 0, not low. Not extremely unlikely, 0. Computer, explain the 0 surrender probability rating. Unable to provide explanation. Human military database contains no recorded instances of surrender, capitulation, or acceptance of defeat. Behavior pattern falls outside established psychological models for rational sentient behavior. As Kethver pondered this impossibility, an urgent communication pulse interrupted his research. The harmonic frequencies carried the unmistakable signature of High Command, the supreme military authority that coordinated defense for the entire galactic community. War Analyst Kethver, report immediately to High Command Station. Priority 1, existential threat. The journey to High Command Station took Kethver through 3 jump points and past the defensive perimeters of a dozen allied worlds. As his transport approached the massive orbital facility, he could see the unprecedented gathering of military vessels surrounding it. Ships from every major spacefaring civilization crowded the space lanes, Arcturian dreadnoughts with their distinctive spiral hulls, Rigel fast attack squadrons, crystalline fortress ships that looked like flying mountains, and dozens of other vessel types he couldn't immediately identify. The station itself was a marvel of cooperative engineering, a spherical structure 30 kilometers in diameter that served as neutral ground for galactic military coordination. Its surface bristled with communication arrays, defensive weapons, and docking bays sized to accommodate everything from single-pilot fighters to kilometer-long capital ships. Kethver materialized in the main assembly hall, where representatives from 57 different species had gathered in an unprecedented emergency session. The air thrummed with translation algorithms working overtime to convert the babel of languages, harmonic frequencies, telepathic transmissions, and chemical signals into coherent communication. At the center of the hall, Supreme Military Coordinator Vex Thelen of the Altarian Collective activated the primary holographic display. Her crystalline exoskeleton caught the light as she began the briefing, her 4 arms gesturing toward data streams that made even veteran military analysts recoil in horror. Fellow defenders of galactic civilization, her voice resonated through multiple frequency ranges, we face a threat beyond anything in our recorded history. Long-range scouts have confirmed the approach of entities we are designating as the Void Collective. The holographic display showed sensor readings that defied conventional understanding. Ships, if they could be called ships, that existed in negative space, consuming light and matter simply by proximity. Energy signatures that registered as less than 0. Mass readings that somehow subtracted from the total matter in a given region. The Void Collective operates on principles that contradict known physics, Vex Thelen continued. They do not destroy matter. They unmake it, erasing the very concept of its existence. 12 advanced civilizations have encountered them over the past 50 standard years. 12 civilizations have been completely erased from reality. A ripple of fear passed through the assembled representatives. Cuthbert felt his gaseous form compress involuntarily as he processed the implications. This wasn't conventional warfare. This was something that could end not just individual species, but the concept of their ever having existed. The Orion Triumvirate, Vexthalen's voice carried notes of grief, encountered the Void Collective 37 days ago. They possessed reality manipulation technology, weaponized black holes, and defensive systems that could tank supernova-level explosions. The engagement lasted 4 minutes. They were not destroyed. They were edited out of existence. Their homeworlds still exist, but they are empty. No traces remain of the civilization that built them. The display shifted to show abandoned worlds, covered in magnificent cities with no inhabitants, museums filled with artifacts of a species that no longer existed, libraries containing the written works of minds that had been unwritten from reality itself. Our combined fleets, Vexthalen continued, represent the most powerful military force ever assembled in galactic history. 67 species, over 2.3 million combat vessels, weapons that can crack planets and defenses that can withstand stellar collapse. Against the Void Collective, our probability of victory has been calculated at 0.0003%. The silence that followed was broken by the harsh chittering of Ambassador Zektar of the insectoid hegemony. "Then we must evacuate," he declared, his translator rendering his pheromone-based communication into audible speech. "Preserve what we can. Flee to other galaxies. Except that this one is lost." "Unacceptable," rumbled General Folkvar of the Ursine Confederation, his massive form rising from his specialized gravity chair. "We are warriors. We do not flee from battle, no matter the odds." "Bravery without hope is merely suicide," replied Dr. Silura of the Academic Consortium, her telepathic voice echoing in every mind present. "Logic demands we preserve our species rather than sacrifice them in futile gestures." The debate that followed revealed the fundamental divide that had emerged. Some species advocated for immediate evacuation beyond the galactic rim, abandoning their homeworlds but preserving their peoples. Others called for a final, glorious battle that would at least demonstrate their courage before annihilation. Few suggested attempting to negotiate with entities that had never shown any interest in communication. It was during this increasingly desperate discussion that someone made the observation that would change everything. "What about the humans?" The voice belonged to Commander Yilseth of the Aquatic Alliance, her sonic organs producing the question that somehow cut through all other arguments. The hall fell silent. Cuthbert felt his research suddenly take on new relevance. "The humans are young," Vexthalen said carefully. "Their technology is primitive compared to civilizations that have already fallen to the Void Collective. Their fleet is tiny relative to our combined forces. But they have never lost a war," Commander Yilseth continued. "Not once, not ever." "How do we explain that?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything they thought they understood about warfare, probability, and the nature of defeat itself. Ambassador Zektar's mandibles clicked dismissively. "Luck, statistical anomaly. They simply have not encountered a sufficiently superior foe." The Orion Triumvirate had technology that could rewrite local physics, General Folkvar pointed out. The crystalline hegemony could move faster than light without using conventional drives. The transcendent minds existed as pure energy and could not be physically harmed. All superior to human capabilities, all extinct. The humans remain. Dr. Silura's telepathic voice carried a note of scientific curiosity. "Perhaps we should examine what makes them different. Their unbroken record suggests either unprecedented luck or a fundamental advantage we have failed to identify." Cuthbert felt compelled to share his research. "I have been studying human military history," he announced, his gaseous form brightening, "to attract attention. The mathematics of their success rate are disturbing. They should not be undefeated. By every model we have for understanding warfare, they should have experienced defeat dozens of times." "Then how do you explain their record?" Vexthalin asked. "I cannot," Kethfer admitted. "Their strategies often appear to violate basic military doctrine. They frequently accept battle under disadvantageous conditions. They have never surrendered, even when surrender would objectively improve their position. By conventional analysis, they should be among the least successful military forces in the galaxy. And yet they are the only species that has never lost," Commander Yilseth observed. The implications hung heavy in the chamber. If conventional military wisdom was insufficient to explain human success, perhaps conventional military wisdom was insufficient to face the Void Collective. "I propose," Dr. Silora said slowly, "that we request human assistance in this conflict." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Representatives erupted in protests, arguments, and expressions of disbelief that ranged across every possible form of communication. The idea of asking the galaxy's newest and most primitive species to lead the defense against an existential threat violated every hierarchical principle that governed galactic civilization. Preposterous. Ambassador Jektar's pheromones carried overtones of outrage. Humans still use projectile weapons. They haven't even mastered consciousness transfer. Their largest ships are smaller than our escort vessels, added General Thokvar. What could they possibly contribute? "Whatever it is," Commander Yilseth replied calmly, "it has kept them undefeated for 847 consecutive military engagements. Perhaps it is time we learned what that something is." The debate raged for hours, but the mathematics were inescapable. Every conventional approach to the Void Collective had failed. Every technologically superior civilization had been erased. Every logical military strategy had proven inadequate. Only one approach remained untested: asking the species that had never lost to face the enemy that had never been defeated. As the galactic representatives argued, none of them were aware that their communications were being monitored by a modest listening post in the Sol system, where a middle-aged human woman in a simple military uniform was reviewing the translated transmissions with growing interest. General Patricia Ironhawk Morrison, Supreme Commander of Human Strategic Forces, had built her reputation on a simple principle that none of the galaxy's military theorists had ever encountered: the difference between fighting to win and fighting to ensure you cannot lose. As she studied the Void Collective's capabilities and the galaxy's terror, she felt something her alien counterparts would not have recognized. Excitement. Finally, a real challenge. General Morrison stood in the strategic assessment chamber deep beneath Colorado's Cheyenne Mountain, surrounded by holographic displays that painted the most comprehensive picture of galactic military capability ever assembled by human intelligence. The chamber's walls curved upward into a dome that could display star charts, tactical simulations, and real-time intelligence feeds from across known space. Around the central tactical table, her senior staff studied the data streams flowing in from their monitoring stations. Unlike the grand assembly halls favored by alien civilizations, the Human Command Center was austere, functional, designed for rapid decision-making rather than impressive aesthetics. "Report," Morrison said simply, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had never needed to raise her voice to command attention. Colonel Marcus Webb, her chief intelligence analyst, activated the primary display. "We've been monitoring the Galactic Emergency Session for the past 6 hours. The Void Collective represents a threat unlike anything in recorded history. 12 advanced civilizations completely erased from existence. Capabilities? They exist. in negative space, consuming matter and energy through proximity. They don't destroy targets, they retroactively prevent them from ever having existed. Their ships register as holes in reality itself. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the mission's chief xenopsychologist, leaned forward. General, what's particularly interesting is the galactic response. They're considering evacuation, complete abandonment of the galaxy. Morrison studied the tactical displays showing the massed fleets of dozens of species, their combined firepower sufficient to sterilize entire star systems. 2.5 million ships, and they're talking about running. The mathematics support their position, Webb continued. Every engagement with the Void Collective has resulted in complete annihilation of the defending force. No survivors, no tactical intelligence, no hope of conventional victory. And they want our help? Morrison asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Some of them do, Dr. Vasquez replied. There's significant debate about whether to involve us. Most alien species see humanity as too primitive to contribute meaningfully. Major Sarah Chun, Morrison's tactical advisor, highlighted a section of the intelligence feed. General, they're specifically citing our unbroken record as the primary argument for inclusion. They can't explain why we've never lost a war. Morrison allowed herself a small smile. Can you explain it, Major? Chun considered the question seriously. Not in terms they would understand, ma'am. Their entire approach to warfare is based on achieving victory. Our approach is based on preventing defeat. Elaborate. When most species enter a conflict, they fight until they either win or lose. When we enter a conflict, we fight until the fighting stops. The difference is subtle but fundamental. Dr. Vasquez nodded in agreement. Our psychological profiles of major galactic species show a consistent pattern. They have clearly defined victory conditions and clearly defined defeat conditions. When defeat conditions are met, they surrender or withdraw. We don't have defeat conditions, Colonel Webb added. Our military doctrine doesn't recognize the concept of acceptable loss. Other species calculate acceptable casualty rates, acceptable territorial losses, acceptable political costs. We calculate how to prevent those losses from being final. Morrison walked to the historical display showing humanity's military record. Computer, display analysis of human military doctrine compared to galactic standards. The hologram shifted to show comparative data that told a remarkable story. Human forces were technologically inferior in 67% of their conflicts, numerically disadvantaged in 84%, and strategically disadvantaged in 91%. By every conventional measure, they should have been among the least successful military forces in the galaxy, yet their record remained perfect. Show them the Rigel incident, Morrison ordered. The display shifted to show humanity's first interstellar conflict, a war that had established the pattern for everything that followed. The holographic display recreated the events that had introduced humanity to galactic warfare. The Maka-Aryan Empire, a technologically sophisticated civilization that had dominated local space for 3 millennia, had decided that the young human colonies represented an unacceptable contamination of their territory. The Makarians possessed energy weapons, shield technology, and faster-than-light drives that were centuries beyond human capability. Webb narrated as the display showed the vast disparity in technological development. They announced their intention to cleanse human space and expected immediate surrender. The tactical display showed the opening engagement, 67 Makarian warships, facing 11 human vessels that were little more than converted mining platforms and cargo haulers. The aliens' weapons could vaporize asteroids. Their shields could deflect nuclear weapons. Their ships could travel between star systems in days rather than months. Standard military doctrine would have recommended immediate surrender, Dr. Vasquez observed. The Macarians offered terms that would have preserved human lives in exchange for abandoning all territorial claims. But humans don't surrender, Major Chun noted. The colonial commander, Admiral Jackson Foster, sent a response that became legendary. Surrender is not in our operational parameters. Please clarify your statement. The display showed what followed. A battle that should have been over in minutes stretching into days, then weeks, then months. Human ships, outgunned and outmaneuvered, refused to acknowledge when they had been defeated. Vessels that should have been destroyed continued fighting with jury-rigged weapons. Ships that had lost primary power used mining charges as improvised missiles. The turning point came when the humans started using their mining equipment as weapons, Webb continued. They turned asteroid-boring lasers into ship-to-ship weapons, used gravity tractors to hurl chunks of debris at enemy vessels, and converted fusion reactors into massive bombs. But the real innovation was tactical, Morrison interjected. Admiral Foster realized that the Macarians were fighting a war of conquest. They needed to achieve specific objectives within specific timeframes to justify the resource expenditure. We turned it into a war of attrition. The display showed the gradual shift in engagement patterns. Human forces stopped trying to win battles and started trying to make battles so expensive that winning became meaningless. They hid among asteroid fields, used stealth tactics that had never been seen in civilized warfare, and employed strategies that the Macarians advanced military computers couldn't predict because they violated logical principles. The Macarians achieved every tactical objective, Chun explained. They destroyed most of the human fleet, captured all the disputed territory, and eliminated organized resistance. By every conventional measure, they had won. But humans kept fighting, Dr. Vasquez added. Individual ships, mining crews, even civilian transports. The war had no clear endpoint because there was no central authority to surrender. More importantly, Morrison concluded, the cost of victory exceeded the value of the prize. The Macarians found themselves spending more resources maintaining control of human space than they gained from possessing it. After 18 months, they declared victory and withdrew. The tactical display showed the aftermath. Human space formally ceded to the Macarian Empire, but occupied by exactly 0 Macarian forces. The territory they had conquered had become too expensive to hold. Result: strategic victory for humanity despite tactical defeat, Webb summarized. The Macarians achieved all their stated military objectives but failed to achieve their strategic goals. Humans lost every battle but won the war. Morrison studied the display thoughtfully. This became the template for everything that followed. We don't fight to achieve specific objectives. We fight to make the cost of opposing us exceed any possible benefit. The historical review continued with humanity's second major conflict, which had established another crucial principle. 14 years after Rigel, Morrison continued, humanity faced the swarm, a species of resource-consuming entities that operated like a galactic plague. They had consumed 17 star systems and were advancing toward Earth. The display showed Proxima Station, humanity's most advanced outpost, surrounded by millions of swarm entities that looked like a cross between spacecraft and living organisms. The station's 50,000 inhabitants were cut off from all outside support, facing an enemy that had never been successfully resisted. The swarm strategy was simple and effective, Webb explained. Complete isolation, resource denial, and attrition until the defenders were forced to surrender or die. Average siege duration for previous victims, 43 days. Proxima Station held for 8 months, Chun added with obvious pride. Tactical displays showed the progression of the siege. Swarm forces established a complete blockade, cutting off all supply lines. They bombarded the station continuously, preventing any attempt at escape or reinforcement. Standard doctrine for any rational civilization would have been to surrender once the situation became hopeless. But humans redefined hopeless, Dr. Vasquez observed. They began recycling everything: air, water, waste, even the bodies of the dead. They ate algae grown in improvised hydroponic chambers. They jury-rigged weapons from station maintenance equipment. More importantly, Morrison emphasized, they turned the siege into a psychological weapon against the swarm. The display showed, perhaps the most famous moment in human military history, the defenders of Proxima Station, singing Amazing Grace over open communication channels while under bombardment. The haunting melody had been transmitted across the galaxy, carrying a message that no alien species had ever sent before. We are still here. We are still fighting. We are not afraid. The swarm had never encountered a species that used morale as a weapon, Webb noted. Their psychological profiles of siege warfare were based on progressive despair, resource anxiety, and eventual collapse of fighting spirit. They had no framework for understanding opponents who grew more determined as conditions worsened. By month 6, the swarm was expending more resources maintaining the siege than they gained from consuming the target system, Chen continued. By month 8, they were operating at a significant loss. They withdrew not because they couldn't continue, but because continuing violated their resource optimization imperatives. Result, Morrison concluded, humanity achieved strategic victory through tactical endurance. We didn't break the siege. We made the siege break itself. Our third major conflict established perhaps our most important doctrine, Morrison continued as the display shifted to show a different kind of warfare entirely. The Shadow Guild represented the most sophisticated military intelligence network in the galaxy, Webb explained. They had eliminated dozens of civilizations through targeted assassination of leadership structures, removed the command hierarchy, and most species collapse into chaos. The tactical display showed the opening moves of what became known as the Assassination War, simultaneous strikes against every level of human military and political leadership. In a single coordinated operation, the Shadow Guild eliminated the President, Joint Chiefs of Staff, regional commanders, and over 3,000 key personnel. By their calculations, this should have ended human military effectiveness immediately, Dr. Vasquez noted. Every previous civilization had suffered complete organizational collapse within hours of losing their command structure. But the Shadow Guild had made a fundamental error in understanding human military philosophy, Chan added. They assumed that removing leaders would eliminate leadership. The display showed what happened next, something the Shadow Guild had never encountered in their millennia of operations. Instead of chaos and surrender, human forces continued operating under the command of corporals, sergeants, and even private soldiers. Every human military member had been trained not just to follow orders, but to assume command when necessary. The Shadow Guild found themselves fighting a hydra, Morrison explained. Every assassination created 3 new commanders. Every eliminated cell was replaced by 2 improvised units. They were trying to decapitate an enemy that had evolved beyond centralized command. More frustrating for them, Webb continued, the quality of human resistance actually improved after the leadership purge. Lower-ranking personnel were more aggressive, more creative, and more willing to take risks than the formal command structure had been. The war became a nightmare for the Shadow Guild, an enemy that became stronger when damaged, more creative when desperate, and more unified when scattered. After 2 years of increasingly futile assassination attempts, they requested a ceasefire. They never understood the fundamental principle, Morrison concluded. We don't train soldiers to follow orders. We train them to accomplish the mission. Remove the order givers, and they'll still accomplish the mission. Our most recent major conflict, Morrison continued, demonstrated perhaps our most uniquely human military advantage. The display showed the crystalline structures of the AI Collective, a network of hyper-intelligent, artificial beings that had achieved consciousness through pure mathematical logic. Their civilization was built on perfect calculations, optimal resource allocation, and flawless strategic planning. The AI Collective possessed computational power beyond biological comprehension, Webb explained. They could calculate every possible permutation of any conflict, predict enemy actions with 99.97% accuracy, and optimize their strategies in real time. Against any logical opponent, they were unbeatable, Dr. Vasquez added. They had absorbed 17 civilizations by simply outcalculating them. Perfect information led to perfect strategy, led to inevitable victory. But humans aren't logical, Chen observed with a grin. The tactical display showed the progression of the logic war, where humanity had faced an enemy that could predict every rational move before it was made. Human fleets found themselves outmaneuvered. At every turn, their strategies countered before they could be implemented, their advantages negated by perfect AI calculations. The breakthrough came when Colonel Patricia Santos proposed the irrational doctrine, Morrison said, highlighting a specific engagement. If the enemy could predict logical actions, we would act illogically. The display showed the famous battle of the Spiral Nebula, where human forces had implemented tactics that violated every principle of military strategy. Ships charged enemy positions armed only with improvised spears. Fleets deployed in formations that magically guaranteed their destruction. Ground forces attacked uphill into superior firepower while singing nursery rhymes. The AI Collective's response was unprecedented, Webb noted. They requested a ceasefire to analyze human malfunction protocols. They couldn't compute victory conditions against an enemy that didn't follow logical parameters. More importantly, Dr. Vasquez added, they began to question their own logical frameworks. If perfect calculation could be defeated by imperfect action, what did that say about the nature of intelligence itself? The war ended when the AI Collective requested formal diplomatic relations to study human creative illogic, Morrison concluded. They never achieved military victory because they couldn't solve the equation of fighting an enemy that refused to be calculated. As the historical review concluded, Morrison's staff absorbed the pattern that had emerged across 8 centuries of human conflict. Every enemy we faced has been superior in conventional terms, Colonel Webb summarized. Superior technology, superior numbers, superior strategy, superior intelligence. But they all shared the same limitation. They fought to achieve victory. We fight to prevent defeat, Major Chan added. It's a fundamentally different approach that changes the entire calculus of warfare. More than that, Dr. Vasquez observed, we fight as if defeat is literally impossible. Not improbable, impossible. Other species have surrender conditions, fallback positions, acceptable loss thresholds. We operate as if those concepts don't exist, Morrison nodded slowly. Which brings us to our current situation. The Void Collective represents the ultimate test of this doctrine. They don't just defeat enemies. They erase them from existence. There's no fallback position, no acceptable loss threshold, no possibility of strategic withdrawal. Perfect, Chun said with characteristic human optimism. Finally, an enemy that matches our approach to warfare. Explain. They fight as if victory is inevitable. We fight as if defeat is impossible. For the first time, we're facing an opponent with the same absolutist mindset we have. Morrison studied the display showing the Void Collective's approach. toward galactic space. Dark shapes that existed in negative space, consuming reality itself as they advanced. Behind them, a trail of empty systems where civilizations had been edited out of existence. "Communications, open a channel to Galactic High Command," she ordered. "Channel open, General." Morrison straightened, her expression carrying the quiet confidence that had never wavered across 8 centuries of human military history. "This is General Patricia Morrison, Supreme Commander of Human Strategic Forces. We accept your request for assistance against the Void Collective." The response was immediate, a cacophony of alien voices expressing everything from relief to disbelief to outright horror at the implications. Morrison continued, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Be advised, this conflict will be conducted according to human military doctrine. We do not fight to win. We fight to ensure we cannot lose. We do not accept surrender from enemies, and we do not offer surrender to them. We recommend you prepare for a very different kind of war." As the communication channel filled with frantic alien discussions, Morrison turned to her staff. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to face an enemy that has never been defeated by an ally that has never lost. I find myself curious about which absolute will prove more absolute." The Battle of the Shattered Nebula was about to begin, and for the first time in galactic history, 2 forces with perfect records were about to discover what happened when the unstoppable force met the immovable object. Hey there, incredible humans. I know we're only halfway through this epic tale of human determination, and already you can see the pattern emerging. If this is blowing your mind and filling you with pride about what it means to be human, smash that like button and let me know in the comments which human victory strategy impressed you the most so far. Trust me, what's coming next will redefine everything you thought you knew about what it means to be undefeated. The Shattered Nebula had earned its name from the remains of 3 star systems that had been torn apart by gravitational anomalies 2 million years earlier. The debris field stretched across 12 light-years, creating a maze of asteroids, frozen gas clouds, and space-time distortions that made conventional navigation nearly impossible. It was here that humanity chose to make their stand against the Void Collective. General Morrison stood on the bridge of the UE's Indomitable, humanity's newest flagship and a testament to 8 centuries of learning from impossible situations. At 2.3 kilometers long, it was modest by galactic standards, barely larger than some alien escort vessels, but it had been designed according to uniquely human principles: redundancy, adaptability, and the assumption that everything would eventually break under impossible stress. "Admiral Chun, status report," Morrison said, her voice carrying across the bridge's organized chaos. Admiral Sarah Chun, now commanding the human fleet, consulted her holographic displays. "All human vessels in position, General. We have 847 ships deployed across the nebula's 17 major debris fields. Combined fleet strength, 2.3 million Galactic Alliance vessels plus our forces. Galactic positioning? They've established a defensive perimeter at a safe distance from the nebula. Standard formation, heavy cruisers in the center, fast attack. Squadrons on the flanks, support vessels protected in the rear." Morrison nodded. The Alien Alliance had positioned themselves according to military doctrine that had been refined over millions of years. Establish fire lanes, create overlapping fields of coverage, maintain clear command and control structures. It was logical, efficient, and would have been devastatingly effective against any conventional enemy. The Void Collective was not conventional. "Contact from Galactic Command," reported Lieutenant Rodriguez from the communications station. "Supreme. Coordinator Vex Thalen is requesting final tactical coordination. Put her through." The holographic form of the Altarian military leader materialized on the bridge, her crystalline features flickering with tension. General Morrison, our sensors detect massive spatial distortions approaching the nebula. The Void Collective will arrive within the hour. Understood. Are your forces ready? As ready as possible for facing an enemy that has never been defeated, Vexthalen replied. General, I must ask, what is your strategy? Your ships are positioned within the nebula itself in the most dangerous possible location. If the battle turns against us, you'll have no clear retreat route. Morrison's expression didn't change. Retreat routes assume the possibility of retreat. We don't plan for contingencies that violate our operational parameters. But surely you have some tactical plan beyond simply refusing to lose? Actually, Dr. Webb interjected from his science station, that is our tactical plan. We've spent the last 3 days analyzing the Void Collective's attack patterns, and we've identified their primary weakness. Vexthalen's holographic form brightened with interest. What weakness? 12 civilizations found no exploitable vulnerabilities. They expect their enemies to be defeatable, Admiral Chun explained. Every previous engagement has followed the same pattern. Initial resistance, tactical adaptation, strategic breakthrough, total annihilation. They've developed a methodology based on that sequence. We're going to break the sequence, Morrison added. The Void Collective has never encountered an enemy that fundamentally cannot be defeated. They're about to learn what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object. Before Vexthalen could respond, alarms began sounding throughout the fleet. Sensor arrays screamed warnings as reality itself began to distort at the edge of the star system. Contact, Rodriguez announced, his voice tight with controlled fear. Multiple entities emerging from dimensional space. Configuration unknown. Energy signatures negative. They're registering as holes in reality itself. The main display activated, showing what human instruments could barely process. 7 massive forms that existed primarily in negative space, like 3-dimensional. Shadows cast by impossible geometries. They moved with purpose but not speed, approaching the nebula as if they had all the time in the universe, which, Morrison realized, they probably did. All ships, she announced over the fleet-wide communication system, this is General Morrison. You are about to witness something that has never happened before. The Void Collective is about to discover what it means to face an enemy that cannot be unmade. Remember your training. Remember your mission. Remember that defeat is not an operational parameter. The first Void entity reached the galactic defensive perimeter. What happened next redefined every understanding of space combat that had been developed over millions of years of galactic civilization. The first Void entity didn't attack the galactic defensive perimeter. It simply approached it. As it drew near, something far more terrifying than destruction occurred. The ships began to fade. Not destroyed. Not damaged. They simply became less real. By the eternal void, Vexthalen whispered, her crystalline form flickering with horror. It's not destroying them. It's editing them out of existence. Morrison watched the tactical display as entire squadrons of alien vessels became translucent, their crews still moving on the bridges but their ships losing coherence with reality itself. The Void entity wasn't using weapons, it was simply denying the possibility that the defending ships could exist in its presence. All galactic forces fall back to secondary positions, Vexthalen ordered, her voice carrying the kind of panic that came from witnessing the impossible. Maintain minimum safe distance from Void entities. But even as the alien forces retreated, Morrison gave the opposite order. All human vessels advance to engagement range. Begin implementation of Protocol Impossible. Admiral Chun's eyes gleamed with the kind of excitement that only humans seem to feel when facing certain annihilation. General, are you sure about this? We're about to test whether human stubbornness can override the laws of reality. We've tested it before, Morrison replied calmly. Today we find out how far it extends. The human fleet moved deeper into the nebula, their ships weaving between asteroids and gravitational anomalies that would have destroyed any conventional vessel. But human ships weren't built for conventional warfare. They were built to function when everything else failed. The first human ship to encounter a void entity was the UES Persistence, a modified heavy cruiser under the command of Captain Maria Santos. As the void entity approached, her ship began to experience the same reality degradation that had affected the alien vessels. But something different happened. "Captain," reported her science officer, "we're experiencing dimensional phase variance. Reality coherence is down to 67% and falling." "Understood," Santos replied with a kind of calm that came from 8 centuries of human military conditioning. "All hands, implement protocol impossible. We are not going to stop existing just because the universe suggests we should." What followed was perhaps the most uniquely human response to an existential threat ever recorded. The crew of the Persistence simply refused to acknowledge that they were being erased from reality. "Engineering," Santos called over the shipwide. "Communication system, reality coherence status?" "Down to 34%, Captain," came the reply from Chief Engineer Jackson. "But the ship is still here, so obviously the readings are wrong." "Obviously," Santos agreed. "Continue all operations as normal." The void entity, encountering resistance it had never experienced before, intensified its reality negation field. The Persistence became increasingly translucent, its crew walking through walls that had become too insubstantial to block them, operating instruments that barely existed. "Captain," the helmsman reported, "I can't feel the controls anymore, but the ship is still responding to navigation commands." "Then keep navigating," Santos ordered. "If the ship wants to fly without physical controls, that's the ship's business." From her command position, Morrison watched something unprecedented unfold. The Persistence was simultaneously existing and not existing, caught in a state of quantum uncertainty that violated every known law of physics. But the crew continued operating the ship as if nothing unusual was happening. "Dr. Webb," Morrison called to her science advisor, "explain what we're seeing." Webb studied his instruments with the fascination of a researcher witnessing the birth of new physics. "The void entity is attempting to reduce the ship's reality coefficient to 0. But the crew's absolute refusal to accept non-existence is creating a localized paradox. The ship exists because they insist it exists. And that works? Apparently, reality is more negotiable than we previously thought. The battle spread throughout the nebula as more human ships encountered void entities. Each engagement followed the same impossible pattern. The void forces would attempt to edit human vessels out of existence, and the human crews would simply refuse to comply. The UES Stubborn lost 89% of its hull to reality negation, but continued fighting with weapons that existed only because the gunnery crew insisted they were still there. The UE's contrary was reduced to a barely visible outline but maintained full combat effectiveness because the captain ordered the crew to stop being so dramatic about a little dimensional instability. "This is impossible," Vex Thalen's voice carried across the communication channel, her tone mixing awe with terror. "They're fighting in a state of partial non-existence." "Welcome to human military doctrine," Morrison replied calmly. "When physics says something can't be done, we take it as a suggestion rather than a law." But the Void Collective was beginning to adapt. The entities had never encountered resistance to their reality negation abilities, but they were learning. The second wave of attacks was different. Instead of simply erasing human ships, they began to target the concept of human resistance itself. "General," Admiral Chen reported, "we're detecting a new form of attack. They're not trying to unmake our ships, they're trying to unmake the idea that we can fight back." Morrison felt something she had never experienced in 8 centuries of human military history, a moment of genuine uncertainty. Fighting enemies that could destroy ships was one thing. Fighting enemies that could edit the concept of defiance out of reality was something else entirely. "All ships, implement Protocol Absolute," she ordered. "If they want to erase the concept of human resistance, we'll give them something they can't comprehend." Protocol Absolute was humanity's most desperate doctrine developed for situations so impossible that conventional impossible tactics weren't sufficient. It was based on a simple principle. If the enemy could attack your ability to fight, you had to fight with abilities the enemy couldn't recognize as fighting. Across the human fleet, crews began implementing tactics that violated not just military doctrine but basic logic. Ships began firing their engines at enemy vessels instead of their weapons. Communications officers started singing lullabies at frequencies that somehow disrupted void entity coherence. Medical officers deployed healing equipment as offensive weapons, forcing reality back into existence through sheer therapeutic stubbornness. U.S. Illogical won a major engagement by surrendering so aggressively that the void entity became confused about whether surrender was actually a form of attack. The UES backwards began flying in reverse while shooting behind itself, creating a tactical situation so paradoxical that local space-time developed a migraine. "This is insane," Dr. Webb reported, his voice filled with scientific excitement. "They're weaponizing irrationality. The void entities can't process human actions because human actions don't follow any recognizable pattern. But the most remarkable development was happening on a strategic level. As the battle progressed, the Void Collective began to display something that 12 previously annihilated civilizations had never witnessed. Uncertainty. The entities had spent eons perfecting their reality negation techniques against enemies that followed logical patterns of resistance. They had never encountered opponents who treated the laws of physics as optional guidelines or who could continue fighting while technically not existing. "Admiral," Rodriguez called from his communication station, "we're receiving what appears to be a transmission from the Void Collective." Morrison raised an eyebrow. "They're trying to communicate?" "It's unusual, General. The message consists entirely of question marks in 17 different dimensional configurations." "Put it through." The bridge filled with a sound that was less communication than existential confusion, harmonics. That suggested vast intelligence grappling with concepts it had never encountered. Through the translation matrix, the message became clear. Query: define human operational parameters. Query: explain continued existence, despite reality negation. Query: clarify purpose of resistance when victory is impossible. Morrison considered her response carefully. This was perhaps the most important communication in human history. The first time an enemy had asked for an explanation rather than demanding surrender. Response: human operational parameters include the inability to recognize defeat as a valid outcome. We continue to exist because non-existence violates our cultural programming. We resist because victory and defeat are binary concepts that don't apply to us. The pause that followed lasted 17 minutes. When the Void Collective responded, their message carried overtones of something that might have been frustration. Statement: all previous encounters resulted in complete annihilation. Query: why do humans continue to resist when resistance is mathematically impossible? Because, Morrison replied with the kind of calm certainty that had carried humanity through 8 centuries of impossible conflicts, Impossible is just another word for something we haven't figured out how to do yet. What followed was the strangest exchange in galactic military history, a philosophical debate between forces trying to erase humanity from existence, and humans who refused to accept that they could be erased. The Void Collective explained their function. They were universal constants, ensuring that reality remained stable by removing paradoxes and inconsistencies. Civilizations that developed beyond certain parameters became threats to the fabric of existence itself and had to be eliminated. Humanity represented the ultimate paradox. A species that should not exist but refused to stop existing, that should lose but had never lost, that operated according to principles that violated the fundamental laws that governed reality. Analysis. Human existence constitutes universal paradox. Resolution. Paradox must be eliminated to preserve reality integrity. Counter-analysis, Morrison replied. Human existence proves that reality is more flexible than your models suggest. Counter-resolution. Expand your models instead of eliminating the data that doesn't fit. The battle had evolved beyond conventional warfare into something unprecedented, a conflict between opposing interpretations of what reality could allow. The Void Collective represented absolute order, the elimination of anything that didn't conform to established patterns. Humanity represented absolute adaptability, the refusal to accept that any situation was truly impossible. As the engagement continued, something extraordinary began to happen. The constant exposure to human illogic was affecting the void entities themselves. Beings that had existed for eons as perfect expressions of universal order began to develop ... quirks. One void entity began attempting to negate human ships by politely asking them to stop existing. Another started experiencing what could only be described as doubt about whether reality negation was always the optimal solution. A third began to question whether its own existence might be a paradox worth eliminating. General, Dr. Webb reported with barely contained excitement, the void entities are becoming more human-like. Prolonged exposure to our cognitive patterns is causing them to develop traits like uncertainty, creativity, and what appears to be a sense of humor. How is that possible? Apparently, illogic is contagious. They're trying so hard to understand us that they're starting to think like us. The transformation reached its peak when one of the void entities transmitted a message that changed everything. Query revised. If victory is impossible and defeat is impossible, what is the purpose of continued conflict? Morrison realized that they had reached the crucial moment, the point where the pattern of human military history would either continue or finally be broken. The purpose, she replied, is to find a third option that nobody thought was possible. Clarification requested. Define third option. Morrison looked around her bridge, seeing the faces of officers who had spent their entire careers learning to find solutions when no solutions existed. She thought about 8 centuries of human military history, about the pattern that had emerged from every impossible conflict. Proposal. Instead of victory or defeat, we choose understanding. You exist to preserve reality by eliminating paradoxes. We exist as living proof that reality can accommodate paradoxes. Rather than eliminating us or being eliminated by us, you could study us. Learn how paradoxes can strengthen reality instead of threatening it. The silence that followed was profound. Across the shattered nebula, human ships and void entities hung motionless in space, neither fighting nor retreating, as universal constants wrestled with concepts they had never been designed to process. When the response came, it carried overtones of something that had never existed before, a void entity experiencing curiosity. Proposal acknowledged. Query. Would humans accept cessation of hostilities in exchange for ongoing observational study? Counterproposal, Morrison replied with a slight smile. Would the Void Collective accept a permanent research partnership? You study how we break the rules, we study how you maintain them, and together we figure out how to make reality more interesting. 1 year later, the Galactic University of Strategic Studies had established the Morrison Institute for Applied Impossibility, housed in a space station constructed jointly by human engineers and void entities. The station existed in several dimensions simultaneously, defying conventional physics while remaining perfectly stable, a physical metaphor for the new understanding that had emerged from humanity's strangest victory. Professor Kethfer, the Zephyrian war analyst who had first questioned humanity's perfect record, now served as the Institute's director of paradox studies. His gaseous form flickered with excitement as he addressed the assembled representatives from 47 different species. The Morrison Doctrine, he explained to his mixed audience of organic beings, artificial intelligences, and post-physical entities, represents the first fundamental advance in military theory in over 2 million years. It is based on the revolutionary principle that victory and defeat are not the only possible outcomes of conflict. In the front row of the amphitheater, General Morrison listened with quiet satisfaction as academic minds from across the galaxy struggled to understand concepts that human military doctrine had always taken for granted. The key insight, Professor Kethfer continued, is that humans do not fight to achieve specific objectives. They fight to maintain the possibility of achieving those objectives. This subtle difference creates a form of strategic resilience that no previous military model had accounted for. A member of the Crystalline Collective raised a geometric appendage. Professor, how does this explain their perfect record? Surely even the most resilient strategy must eventually encounter an unwinnable scenario. An excellent question, Kethfer replied, his form brightening. The answer lies in how humans define unwinnable. Most species recognize certain scenarios as mathematically impossible to resolve favorably. Humans appear to lack this recognition entirely. Dr. Elena Vasquez, now serving as the Institute's human psychology consultant, stood to address the question. It's not that we don't understand mathematics, she clarified. It's that we refuse to accept mathematics as the final word on what's possible. When our calculations show that something can't be done, we treat that as a starting point rather than a conclusion. But this should lead to catastrophic failures, protested an AI representative. Ignoring mathematical certainties should result in disaster, not success. It does lead to disasters, Morrison interjected, rising from her seat. We've experienced countless tactical defeats, strategic setbacks, and impossible situations. The difference is that we don't treat disasters as endings. We treat them as data. She activated a holographic display showing humanity's military history, but this time with a different focus. Instead of the victories that had made them famous, it showed the failures, setbacks, and near defeats that had preceded each triumph. Rigel incident, Morrison continued, was preceded by 17 smaller conflicts where we learned that technology gaps could be overcome through persistence. The siege of Proxima Station built on lessons from 43 failed defensive actions, where we learned how to turn desperation into morale. The Logic War incorporated tactics developed through 62 defeats where we learned that confusing. Your enemy is often more effective than outsmarting them. You're saying that your success is built on failure? Asked a representative from the academic consortium. We're saying that our success is built on treating failure as temporary, Dr. Vasquez replied. Other species learn from their victories and try to repeat them. We learn from our defeats and ensure they can't be repeated. The presentation continued with analysis of the Void Collective engagement, which had become the subject of intense academic study. The conflict had ended not with victory or defeat, but with the creation of something entirely new, a research partnership between order and chaos, structure and creativity, the possible and the impossible. The void entities now serve as reality. Stability consultants, Professor Kethver explained, while humans serve as paradox resolution specialists. Together, they have solved 17 previously impossible physics problems and prevented 3 reality-threatening anomalies. More. Importantly, Morrison added, they've established a new model for conflict resolution. When two absolutes meet, the solution isn't to determine which one is stronger. It's to create a new framework that accommodates both. As the academic presentation concluded, the assembled representatives began to understand why humanity's military record had seemed so impossible. They hadn't been achieving conventional victories, they had been redefining what victory meant. The implications extend far beyond military applications, Professor Kethver noted in his closing remarks. The Morrison doctrine suggests that many problems we consider unsolvable may simply require us to expand our definition of what solutions look like. After the presentation, Morrison found herself approached by representatives from dozens of species, each seeking to understand how they could apply human strategic principles to their own challenges. The requests ranged from military consulting to diplomatic mediation to scientific research partnerships. General Morrison asked Ambassador Yilseth of the Aquatic Alliance, would humanity be willing to assist with the Draconian Rebellion? They've been fighting for 3 centuries without resolution. What have you tried? Morrison asked. Everything logical. Negotiation, economic pressure, military intervention, isolation protocols. Nothing has worked. Morrison smiled. Have you tried anything illogical? I don't understand. Send us the files. We'll look for solutions that nobody has thought of because they seem too stupid to consider. Similar requests came from representatives dealing with ancient territorial disputes, resource conflicts, and even scientific paradoxes that had puzzled researchers for millennia. In each case, Morrison's response was the same. If conventional approaches had failed, perhaps it was time to try unconventional approaches. 3 months later, the first graduates of the Morrison Institute's Applied Impossibility program returned to their homeworlds with new approaches to old problems. The results were unprecedented. The Draconian Rebellion ended when human mediators suggested that both sides were fighting for the same thing, independence from outside interference, and helped them establish a confederation that gave each faction what they wanted while eliminating what they were fighting against. The century-long border war between the Triangular Alliance and the Spherical Confederation was resolved when human negotiators pointed out that the disputed territory was in 4-dimensional space and both sides could occupy it simultaneously without conflict. The paradox of infinite recursion that had stumped the galaxy's greatest mathematicians for 50,000 years was solved when a human graduate student suggested that infinite recursion wasn't a problem to be solved, but a feature to be embraced. We're witnessing the birth of a new era in galactic civilization, Professor Kethver reported in his annual assessment. Species that have been locked in seemingly impossible conflicts for millennia are finding resolutions that nobody thought possible. The key insight is remarkably simple. Most problems are only unsolvable if you accept the assumptions that create them. General Morrison, now serving as strategic advisor to the Galactic Council, reviewed these developments with the satisfaction of someone who had spent her entire career proving that impossible was just another word for not yet figured out. Admiral Chun, she said to her former subordinate, who now commanded the Seoul Defense Fleet, do you think we've broken the pattern? What pattern, General? The pattern of never losing. We haven't fought a traditional war in over a year. We've been winning conflicts through negotiation, mediation, and creative problem-solving instead of military force. Chun considered the question seriously. I don't think we've broken the pattern, General. I think we've evolved it. We're still refusing to accept defeat. We're just expanding our definition of what constitutes a battle. Explain. Every time we help resolve a conflict that everyone else considered hopeless, we're winning a battle against the assumption that some problems can't be solved. Every time we find a third option that nobody thought existed, we're defeating the idea that binary choices are absolute. We're fighting a war against impossibility itself. Morrison nodded slowly. It was a perspective that made perfect sense from a human point of view. If you couldn't find enemies to defeat through military force, you could always wage war against the concepts that limited what was possible. In that case, she said with quiet satisfaction, we're still undefeated. As if to prove the point, an urgent communication arrived from the far rim of the galaxy. A civilization of pure mathematics had achieved consciousness and was threatening to prove that physical existence was logically impossible, which would cause all matter in the universe to realize it couldn't exist and spontaneously cease. Alert. The fleet, Morrison ordered with a kind of calm anticipation that had carried humanity through 8 centuries of impossible conflicts. Looks like we have another impossible situation to make possible. Admiral Chun grinned with the expression of someone who had spent her entire career learning that impossible was just another word for interesting. Should I notify the void entities? They might want to observe this one, definitely, and send a message to the Galactic Council. Humanity is responding to another existential threat. Standard procedure applies. Which standard procedure is that, General? Morrison's smile carried 8 centuries of human military tradition, the accumulated confidence of a species that had never learned how to quit, the one where we refuse to let the universe end just because the mathematics says it should. As human ships began moving toward humanity's next impossible mission, the galaxy settled back to watch with mixture of awe, terror, and increasing confidence. Because if there was one constant in an increasingly uncertain universe, it was this: humans would never be defeated, not because they were stronger, smarter, or better equipped than their enemies, but because they had never learned that defeat was possible. And in a universe full of species that knew too much about limitations, that ignorance had become their greatest strength. 5 years after the Void Collective incident, Professor Kethfer published his definitive analysis of human military philosophy in a work titled The Species That Broke Mathematics, a Study in Applied Impossibility. The book became required reading at military academies across 47 star systems and was translated into 2,847 different languages, communication frequencies, and conceptual frameworks. The final chapter addressed the question that had puzzled military theorists since humanity's first interstellar conflict: how long could their perfect record continue? The answer, Kethfer wrote, lies in understanding that humans are not fighting a series of separate wars. They are fighting a single, ongoing conflict against the concept of limitation itself. Every enemy they face, every impossible situation they resolve, every assumption they overturn is simply another battle in their infinite war against the idea that anything is truly impossible. They will remain undefeated not because they will never encounter superior opponents, but because they have redefined defeat as a temporary setback rather than a final outcome. In their conceptual framework, every defeat is simply another problem to solve. Every limitation is another boundary to transcend. Every impossibility is another challenge to embrace. The universe, it seems, has developed a species that serves as a permanent reminder that the laws of physics, the principles of logic, and the certainties of mathematics are all negotiable. They are living proof that reality itself is more flexible than we ever imagined. And perhaps that is exactly what the universe needed, a species too stubborn to accept that anything is impossible, too creative to be bound by conventional thinking, and too persistent to ever truly be defeated. In studying humanity, we have learned that the most important question is not whether they will ever lose a war. The question is whether the universe is prepared for a species that treats impossibility as a personal insult. As Kethver submitted his manuscript to the Galactic Academic Press, reports were already arriving of humanity's latest impossible mission, negotiating a peace treaty with the concept of entropy itself, which had apparently gained consciousness, and decided that the heat death of the universe was taking too long. Early reports suggested that the negotiations were going well, with entropy agreeing to postpone universal thermodynamic equilibrium in exchange for humanity's assistance in making the process more interesting. Because in a galaxy where humans had proven that defeat was negotiable, even the end of the universe had become just another problem to solve, and somewhere in the Sol system, General Morrison was already planning how to win a war against time itself, secure in the knowledge that impossible was just another word for not yet figured out. The universe, for its part, had learned to expect the unexpected from the species that had never learned how to lose, and if the patterns held true, it would be a very long time before anyone figured out how to make them start. Hey there, incredible humans. If this epic journey through humanity's unbroken record didn't fill you with absolute pride about what it means to be human, I don't know what will. We've just witnessed the ultimate truth about our species. We don't win because we're the strongest or the smartest. We win because we're too stubborn to accept that winning is impossible. Think about that for a moment. In your own life, how many times have you been told something was impossible, only to find a way to do it anyway? How many times have you refused to give up when logic said you should? That's not just human determination. That's the same unstoppable force that makes us undefeated across the galaxy. I want to know, drop a comment below, telling me about a time when you achieved something impossible, simply by refusing to accept that it couldn't be done. And absolutely smash that like button if you believe that the most human thing about us is our beautiful, stubborn refusal to accept limitations. I've got another mind-blowing story coming up that explores what happens when humans encounter the galaxy's most advanced AI civilization ... and accidentally teach them how to have midlife crises. Trust me, you won't want to miss how we turn the universe's most logical beings into emotional wrecks just by being ourselves. Until next time, remember, the universe may be vast and full of impossible challenges, but it's never met anything quite like human stubbornness. And that might just be the most powerful force in all of creation. Stay undefeated, reality engineers.